take a look at these wide receivers on the screen. You'll notice a lot of these guys are going in the same range in Dynasty startup drafts, and they're also in this range where it's like, who do we take? Do I take Aiyuk or Nico Collins or Waddle or Smith or London? They're all 5 going like right in the same ADP range. Do I take Addison? Do I take Zay Flowers? Do I take Rashee Rice when he falls to me, or do I take George Pickens over him? Well, actually, we have the answers. We're going to tell you who to take. We're going to tell you who the best values are of those guys based on statistics, and that ties back into their production because we started looking, and we found some really interesting things, and it's all around one word that starts with an S and ends with an sustainability that really can predict what this next year is going to look like. Now,
sustainability.
That's it. That's the word. So now, let's look at these players and a couple of key metrics here. We started by looking at their targets because all of these players, this is how they're grouped, right?
Yeah, they were inspired by the targets. Like we saw, obviously, a discrepancy in production from a lot of these different guys, and they all had the same target. So it was like, let's get all these guys together from last year.
Because, I mean, we've talked about this many times, but this research, if you could put this graph on the screen, Luke, it suggests that there is a 1-to-1 correlation. I mean, the R-square value is actually 8.551 or something like that, but that's pretty high. There's a 1-to-1 correlation between targets and fantasy production, as you can see by this giraffe here. And so, because of this giraffe, we know that players with the same amount of targets should more or less average out to about the same amount of production, right? No, it didn't happen. And so because of that, let's look into why that happened. Let's look at why there are differences. I'll kind of let you start here with what we found initially when we looked into this data.
Yeah, so what I wanted to start with here is basically your top 2 guys that have a lot of, they have a lot of talk, a lot of buzz around them, a lot of people that are high on them, a lot of people that are low on them. I'm talking about Aiyuk and Collins specifically. Brandon Aiyuk, obviously, the whole situation in San Fran, we don't know if he's going to be on San Fran this year on a different team. And then you got Nico Collins, just got his new big extension. Stephon Diggs comes in, and you're like, look, honestly, regardless of their situation and what's going to happen to them in the future, look at what they did last year with their targets. Look at what they were able to accomplish being borderline wide receiver ones. Look at what their potential is this year. And honestly, we, to an extent, are like, yeah, I mean, they're very talented wide receivers, and they were able to make a lot out of very little. But when you're looking at Aiyuk and Nico Collins specifically, right, Aiyuk had 104 targets this year, 75 receptions, 1,300 yards. So he's a huge yards per target guy, a huge yards per reception guy. Same with Nico Collins, but not quite as extreme, right?
Right.
He had 109 targets, 80 receptions, 1,200 yards for almost the same amount of yards per reception, but a little bit less. So we were kind of looking at these guys, and we were like, these targets aren't elite. In fact, they're below average of what you'd expect for guys producing at the level that they were able to in 2023. And I started thinking, what other guys are there? Drake London stood out to me.
And Waddle.
I want
to point this out real quick.
Zay Flowers.
Yes, I want to point this out real quick. You sort this list by fantasy points, like total fantasy points last year. The top 2 guys are Nico Collins and Brandon Aiyuk with 109, 104 targets. The bottom 2 guys are Jalen Waddle and Drake London with 104 and 109 targets. Literally mirrored. And we're talking about all 4 of those guys going in the same range in Dynasty. Why is it even warranted that those 2 guys are going in the same range as Nico Collins and Aiyuk? Why is that happening? Should it be happening? What are we doing with these players? That's what we're setting out to answer here, and we think we figured it out.
We may have learned, by the way, that because of that info that you just gave them, the variance in production with this current volume for these players is that big.
It's astronomical.
So big that you can't even see my right hand because it's off camera.
I can see it.
It's that big.
I can still see it.
You're talking about the wide receiver from a production perspective 12 versus the wide receiver 36. That's Drake London versus Nico Collins. Holy crap. So how are we going to go into 2024 predicting which one of these guys has sustainable production and which ones don't? It's in the yards per reception. It's in the yards per target. At least that's one of the bigger metrics that we saw.
It is.
There really are 3 that we looked at, though, and those were yards per reception, fantasy points per target, and touchdowns. Everyone always says that touchdowns are the most volatile metric in fantasy football, and that's true, but it's not always the deciding factor in what someone does or doesn't do from a production standpoint, because there are some guys that are lower down here that did have a decent amount of touchdowns, the same amount of touchdowns as Aiyuk and Collins, and they weren't even close to their production.
It's not everything, right?
It's not everything. There are other elements here, and the yards per reception is the other big element here. The fantasy points per target is the third really big element here, and we kind of came up with thresholds. Those thresholds were basically if you had over 14 yards per reception, right? No, over 15.
I did get it at 15.
If you have over 15 yards per reception.
How sustainable is that?
How sustainable is that, realistically? Okay, there's at least a question mark there, and I think everyone watching can admit there's a question mark there, right? That sounds pretty difficult to achieve. Let's just put it in the red, okay? We'll put it in the red and say that it's not sustainable in theory.
The one example we do have of that, because we looked back and tested all of our theories on 2022, the guys in this target range, some of them are repeats, but the one guy that was in this range of targets in 2022 that had a yards per reception over 15 was Jalen Waddle. He had 18.
Yep.
So it checked out for him. As Jalen Waddle, you saw his yards per reception drop a lot.
Yes.
So you saw that it wasn't sustainable. Typically, when you have guys like this that are getting this amount of targets, when you have that amount of yards per reception, even Brandon Aiyuk the year before. Brandon Aiyuk was at 13 yards per reception the year before and flipped up to 18. The odds are it's not going to happen again at 18 yards per reception. But
Correct.
Go ahead. Keep going. Let's keep moving through this.
Yeah, so then we've got our next range here, which is kind of the mid-range of about 12 to 15 yards per reception. If you're under 15, over 12 yards per reception, that's sustainable enough, right? For the most part, it is. And then you've got your very sustainable ones where you see this all the time. Around 11 yards per reception, you're going to see that constantly. You're going to see that across productive wide receivers, non-productive wide receivers. It's just, that's kind of what you expect from
and again,
any
we're
wide
talking
receiver.
about sustainability relative to the amount of targets they're getting. So what's sustainable for guys who are getting 105 to 110 targets a year?
Yes.
Typically what you see when you see guys maintain their production year over year with this amount of targets, you typically see them in this 12 to 13 yards per reception range, right? A guy that has only 109 targets that had 18 yards per reception, that typically doesn't happen twice in a row. Because again, 18 yards per reception, you're talking about a large amount, a large quantity of big plays. And big plays are as volatile, if not more volatile, than touchdowns. This is a volatile stat here, yards per reception. It is a volatile stat, and you saw Jalen Waddle was case in point. It's not like Tyreek Hill was there the year in 2022. Tyreek Hill was there both years. He was used completely different. Same offense, same coach, same everything, same quarterback. Everything was the same, and a difference in 5 yards per reception. So this is a it's a very volatile stat in itself. And so, again, some of this is subjective, and we know that. But this is our channel, and so our opinion is what we're putting out there. And when I'm looking year over year, I don't think that's sustainable. I think the stuff in the green is sustainable. So when we're looking for sustainability, the guys from a yards per reception standpoint, Nico, Brandon Aiyuk, and George Pickens, those are the guys that I'm like, I don't think they're going to do that again. So something's going to have to else be good for me to be like, okay.
Something else is going to have to give, which doesn't mean that their value's totally out of the water. It's not like, they're not going to be.
Just bear with us.
Yeah. So there are other elements here that help us kind of narrow this down and say who are our least favorite values right now and who are our favorite values. Fantasy points per target, which is kind of all encompassing. It includes, how do you score fantasy points?
It's how
receptions,
it's how efficient you
yards, and touchdowns, and what are you getting out of the targets that you're currently receiving? If those are super duper high, if you had to get like close to 2.5 fantasy points per target that you got on the team, that's expecting a lot for every single catch that you get, because you're going to have to turn a lot of those into touchdowns. You're going to have to turn a lot of those into a significant amount of yardage, right? So lo and behold, what did we see? Who had the most fantasy points per target? Well above everyone else in this range, it was Nico Collins and Brandon Aiyuk. 2.39 and 2.42. They were hovering around 2.4 there. Everyone else was right around 2 or below.
And so you literally 1.91 to 2.05, almost everybody fell in that range. There were 2 outliers up top, and the one outlier down below was Drake London. And the one thing you want to say about yards per reception especially is a lot of times this can be indicative of quarterback play. Mm-hmm. This can be indicative of offensive usage and offensive system, right? And so for Drake London, I think it's a perfect example of that.
Actually, DJ Moore had a jump for multiple reasons last year.
But one of them was that his yards per reception, 14, his fantasy points per target, 1.7 last year. Yeah. I mean, you're talking about crazy inefficiency when he was on the Panthers versus when his first year was on the Bears. So looking at fantasy points per target, again, everybody is between that sustainable range of like 1.9 fantasy points per target to 2.1 fantasy points per target. I'll even go. When you're looking at 2022, again, and the reason that I know that this is not sustainable or even not common is because looking back at 2022, of the 10 wide receivers we have here, there was only one that went over 2.1, and it was Jalen Waddle at 2.27. So Jalen Waddle, 2022, not sustainable in yards per reception, not sustainable in fantasy points per target. Okay, so now we have two of these categories where we've kind of ranked sustainability and we've put them in the color-coded categories. And let's talk about the third one here, and that is what we commonly consider the most volatile stat in fantasy, which on the surface it is. When you get into the efficiency metrics, there are all other volatile metrics, but touchdowns.
Yeah, Jordan Addison is the screaming one here. I mean, that's the biggest red flag that you're going to have from Jordan Addison, and everyone knows and everyone admits he had 10 touchdowns last year. He's probably not going to get that again. Probably not. Like, I don't know. It's might be bold, but you generally don't see non-alpha wide receivers get that type of volume with touchdowns specifically. Under that, you've got who had 8 touchdowns. Nico Collins, Jacoby Myers was the other guy. We haven't mentioned Jacoby Myers yet. You can tell all these guys in the same value range roughly. You've got that upper tier of, your Collins, Aiyuk's, Devonta Smiths, then your Zay Flowers sort of range. And then you have Jacoby Myers just sitting in the middle of all of this. Sitting in the middle of all of it. By far and away the cheapest asset, and you're getting the same amount of production. Now, no one's going to go out there. No one in Dynasty is ever going to, we've learned, ever going to overestimate what Jacoby Myers is going to do. So he kind of just is going to be here. No one's ever going to overestimate that. No one's ever going to guess that he's going to have, a Nico Collins level year, because heaven forbid we ever do that.
Right.
But then you've got your green range here of like your 5, 6, 7 touchdowns, which is a little more doable. And then your outliers, again, Drake London at the very bottom, Jalen Waddle at the very bottom. Guess who had a major red flag in 2022 last year at the touchdown with the touchdown metric?
8 touchdowns.
Jalen Waddle, 8 touchdowns.
Slightly above what we would consider average, right?
Cut in half.
And that's what you see. Touchdowns. One year you have a ton. The next year you don't have a lot. So, again, you've got 3 guys up here, Addison, Jacoby Myers, and Nico Collins, that had a lot of touchdowns. You have the guys in the middle here, 5 to 7 touchdowns. That's, I'd say 4 to 7 is probably average, but we did 5 to 7 here. And then you've got 2 guys at the bottom here, Waddle and London, who had 2 and 4 touchdowns, and that's room to grow. So again, when we do this dark green here, we're talking about they've got room to improve. Like, you've got room to improve when you only get 1.6 fantasy points per target, because that's not because of Drake London, the talent. It's not because he's not talented. It's because of how he was used, right? Context is really important, and context can really shift how you analyze this data. You really could shift it. Mm-hmm. But with that being said, now let's kind of look at all 3 of these factors and let's see if we can even use to predict anything in terms of like these guys and what their dynasty value should be. Because, again, the thresholds last year that Jalen Waddle had, where he saw a big regression in points and usage, like how would we have seen that coming is basically what we're trying to figure out. There's really only one guy this year that meets all of those.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's Nico Collins.
It is. I mean, but you had to have seen that coming, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you're talking about 2.39 fantasy points per target. That's efficiency. That's an efficiency level that's not sustainable.
Guys, that's not even accounting for Stephon Diggs entering the offense. Jalen Waddle lost that production in 2022 with no one else being inserted in the offense. It was the 2 of them. And again, that's fantasy points per target. So that doesn't count against Jalen Waddle when he's not playing, because he's not getting targets when he's not playing. Correct.
So that's all encompassing in terms of when he was on the field, how fantasy efficient was he? And look, Nico, 16 yards per reception, 2.4 fantasy points per target, and 8 touchdowns. All 3 of those metrics are considered not sustainable for this range of targets. So Nico, in order for Nico to maintain or increase his dynasty value, even though he got the big contract, and I'm personally not opposed to his dynasty value at all. I'm not opposed to him. I'm not even saying to sell him necessarily. But in order for him to maintain this, what Nico has to do is jump up a tier for targets.
Yep.
You have to see him get, how many did he have this year? 109. I'd say 120 plus targets to maintain
at least
wide receiver 1 status this year, because the odds that he goes 100 to 110 targets and is a wide receiver 1 again, extremely slim. It's just extremely slim. And in range of outcomes, it's just not hardly there.
Yeah, and there's only one other receiver in this range. Of course, it's Brandon Aiyuk, who had more than one red flag, right? In these metrics, it was yards per reception and fantasy points per target, which are the ones to me that are the most important. He was right on the line with the touchdowns on that 7-8 line. But with Aiyuk, he's debatably the most talented receiver on this list, potentially. But again, we're not talking about talent in at the NFL level. We're talking about fantasy points and what's sustainable. And Aiyuk, if you saw his production last year,
it's very up and down.
Very up and down. Very up and down. And again, he was more productive than he ever had been in the past, but still, you can't deny that his 18 yards per reception is going to go down. When was the last time that you saw a hyper-productive wide receiver maintain that yards per reception? Spoiler, you don't. Deshaun Jackson. Yeah. Maybe for a couple years there.
Maybe.
That was the last guy. I want to go on the positive side here because I don't want this to be too negative about just these two players because there's a lot of other receivers to talk about here, and there's a lot more green than there is red. So you're like, okay, yeah, green, that's a good sign. We like seeing green. Green means go. Yay. Not necessarily, not always, because again, what's the range of wide receivers that we're talking about here again? 100 to 110 targets. And what is 100 and 110 targets turned into for most of these wide receivers? About low-end wide receiver 2 production, wide receiver 3 production.
Yeah.
That is not great. And I think that's kind of our point with Nico and Aiyuk, is that's the reason they're the outliers, because all these other receivers that got the same amount of opportunity as they did were way less productive.
Look, Brandon Aiyuk was on this list in 2022. I think this is worth mentioning here.
Yeah.
He was on this list, and he only had one red flag in 2022, meaning that his production from 2022 to 2023 was fairly sustainable. He built on that production, right? The only unsustainable thing he had was touchdowns. This year, he adds another unsustainability metric because he's at what, 2 point?
He added 2 and he got back into the green zone.
Oh yeah, he technically flipped. He's exactly inverse.
Yes,
but still had 7 touchdowns. 7 touchdowns is still on the higher end of vault. Like, I mean, that's still high. I mean, here's what I want to say about this: if Brandon Aiyuk scores 4 touchdowns next year, Brandon Ayuk's a low end wide receiver too.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
no doubt.
This is my takeaway from this. If you have a guy like Jalen Waddle, Brandon Aiyuk, Nico Collins, all going in the same range, super expensive prices right now in Dynasty. If you have any 3 of those guys, I'm not saying that you should always be selling them, but I would strongly recommend down tiering to guys that are getting the same opportunity for a fraction of the price.
Yeah.
I mean, Zay Flowers is a huge one here.
Yes.
Huge. And to me, he might be the biggest outlier outside of Drake London, because Drake London, in fairness, a lot of people are estimating that he is going to increase production dramatically because of Kirk Cousins, and you can tell by all the green here.
Yeah.
People are onto that, and his price is showing accordingly. I'm not the biggest Zay Flowers fan. I've never been the hugest Zay Flowers fan, but I am very respectful of his price, and I understand what you're getting at his current price range. I'm not so much. I'm not as understanding of it with Aiyuk and Nico Collins. Zay Flowers, you can down tier from Aiyuk or Nico Collins to Zay Flowers, and I think have just as good a shot of him sustaining his production or increasing it as Nico Collins and Aiyuk have with their own.
Yeah, and when you're looking at you sorting these guys by dynasty, they're dynasty ADP essentially.
Right.
Jalen Waddle and Drake London are the top of this list, and they were the bottom in production. You're seeing okay, why is this disconnect happening? For Drake London, it's because he's in a prime position to take a big step up this year. For Jalen Waddle, it's because he did average 14 points, fantasy points per game, and he has the highest sustainability rating of almost any person on this list. So with Jalen Waddle, he's scoring this amount of points, but you know he's going to keep doing it. When you're looking at fantasy points per game and you're sorting by that, Jalen Waddle is 4th among these guys in fantasy points per game, and the only guy above 16 here is Nico Collins, who we've already said it's highly unlikely he does this again. And so for Jalen Waddle, the reason that he's up here is because when you're looking at a points per game basis when he's healthy, he actually is doing it at a sustainable level. It's very sustainable. He completely flip-flopped too. He's another guy that's completely inverse. Last year, unsustainable. We would have said last year in this data with these markers, he's probably not going to do that again. He didn't do it again, but what he did this year and his price adjusted this year, that is sustainable. Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk about the sweet spot here. And the sweet spot are going to be the two safest guys that have room to increase. The two, you see one guy here that's just the solid light green all the way across, and that's Devonta Smith. Devonta Smith is the definition of a guy in this range that's going to get a number of targets that is sustainable. 13 yards per reception, sustainable. Two fantasy points per target, sustainable. 7 touchdowns, that's sustainable. And then the other guy here, like you mentioned, was Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers is a guy that's going, when you're looking at his dynasty ADP, he's going 15 spots lower than Devonta Smith, and he has room to improve his yards per reception. He's had the same efficiency in fantasy points per target, and he had 1 less touchdown. So those two guys, to me, like I'm pivoting from some of these guys to those two guys. I'm still buying Drake London because I think there's so much room to improve. I like Jalen Waddle. If you want safety on your dynasty team, I think he's a good buy because of this. With Nico is a curious case because he's got good contract, good situation. I think his value is warranted, but he's not going to do what he did last year. I'd bet the farm on it.
Yeah.
I'd bet the farm on it.
Yeah.
And then Aiyuk again, like you have to see the touchdowns continue for Aiyuk to be this productive.
These are wide receiver 2 caliber targets. That's what they are. 6 of these 10 wide receivers on these lists are objectively wide receiver 2s, or they were when they posted this production. They were. Zay Flowers is the big outlier here, in my opinion. I think Zay Flowers should be the star of the show in this video, honestly. Like, he is the only, for a fact, wide receiver 1 in his offense that is not going even near the price of Collins, Aiyuk, and London. Again, there's a reason for that, and I understand that there's a reason for that. Okay, I'm not going to be totally ignorant of all the things that go into why their prices are so much different. In a vacuum, I would still prefer Aiyuk and Collins and Drake London over Zay Flowers by far.
Sure,
absolutely, for sure. It's not even a question.
For sure.
But again, it's the gap. It's the gap. It's the gap. And look at the variance in production.
Look at
the variance in production.
Let's talk about 2 other hot button players in this data and what it means for them here real quick. Rashee Rice, green in all categories.
This is clearly this is the legal stuff.
ADP 88. Rashee Rice is a huge buy. We've already established that, but the metrics show that what he did with this number of targets is sustainable production-wise, which is contrary to popular belief.
Yes.
And then let's talk about George Pickens. Now, George Pickens is interesting. He has the highest yards per reception of anybody on this list.
Rip.
And he also had 5 touchdowns. That's sustainable. 1.9 fantasy points per target. That's sustainable. So why is George Pickens producing significantly less than a lot of these guys? And why he's third to last on this list in production? Why is that? With that, we saw the high yards per reception for Nico and Aiyuk, and not very many more touchdowns. What's the difference? The difference is
the actual receptions.
It's receptions. George Pickens is not the type of player that you're going to get short to intermediate targets to. George Pickens is a guy you're throwing to down the sideline. It's all about how he's being used. Is that going to change? Is George Pickens' skill set and the way he's being used going to change? Because when you're looking at all these guys, they had at least 70 targets, most of them high 70s up into the 80s. George Pickens had 63 of his 107 targets caught. And that's a testament to bad quarterback play, 1, which you could use to say George Pickens is a buy. I also think it's a big testament to the type of player that George Pickens is, which is why I think his value in Dynasty is about where it should be, honestly. He's got good targets, but he's not bringing in a lot of them. Yes, targets does directly correlate with fantasy points, but you have to catch them. And he's not shown that he's going to catch a high percentage of them compared to the people that are getting the same amount of targets. Yep. So I think it says his price is warranted. Again, I think Zay Flowers and Devonta Smith, you've proven higher upside / safer assets here.
And can you please just get Jacoby Myers as a throw-in? Wherever you
Everywhere.
can. Because he's being treated as a throw-in. He is value equivalent to Isaiah Likely.
We've been saying that, so... Make your own conclusions. That's how we analyze this data. That's the conclusions we took.
Yeah, but you should conclude like we did.
For sure.
Yeah.
You should definitely always think like we do.
Yes.
Flockfantasy.com/domain. Use code domain. Choose some other Flock tier. You get a team blueprint, multi-year plan for your dynasty team. Make sure you like and subscribe. Appreciate you guys. We'll see you later.